Good evening. Tonight, we journey into the heart of humanity's darkest chapter, where the thunder of a million hooves carried death across 2 continents, and where a single man's name became synonymous with terror itself. This is the story of Genghis Khan, a name that still sends shivers through the pages of history 8 centuries after his death. Tonight, you will discover why entire cities chose mass suicide over surrender, why mothers whispered prayers not for victory, but for swift deaths for their children, and why the mere rumor of approaching Mongol banners could empty entire regions overnight. We will uncover the calculated cruelty, the psychological warfare, and the systematic destruction that turned a nomadic herder into the architect of humanity's greatest nightmare. Before we ride deeper into this terrifying story, tell me in the comments below, from what corner of the world are you bearing witness to this tale, and what hour marks your vigil? Are you watching as dawn breaks over lands once trampled by Mongol horses, or does darkness shroud your window as it once shrouded the hopes of countless civilizations? Subscribe now, because unlike the millions who fell before the Khan's wrath, knowledge is your armor against history's cruelest lessons, and the only conquest worth pursuing is the conquest of ignorance that allows such horrors to repeat. The birth of a monster. The year is 1162, and on the vast steppes of Mongolia, a child is born clutching a blood clot in his tiny fist. The shamans whisper that this is an omen, a sign that this boy will spill more blood than any man before him. They call him Temujin, but the world will know him by a different name, a name that will echo through the screams of the dying and the prayers of the terrified. Genghis Khan. But monsters are not born, they are forged in the fires of betrayal and hardship. Young Temujin's father is poisoned by rival Tatars when the boy is only 9 years old. His own tribe abandons his family, leaving them to starve on the unforgiving steppes. Picture this child, watching his mother Holen dig for roots and catch fish with her bare hands, while his infant siblings cry from hunger. In this moment of desperation, something breaks inside Temujin, something that will never heal. The first glimpse of the monster emerges when Temujin is just 14. His half-brother Bekta steals food from the family's meager supplies, and in a moment that would define his character forever, Temujin and his brother, Kesar, hunt Bekta down like an animal. They find him sitting on a hill, and without hesitation, without mercy, they shoot him dead with arrows. When their mother discovers what they have done, she screams that they are destroyers, killers who will devour each other. She could not have known how prophetic her words would prove to be. The steppes teach harsh lessons, and Temujin learns them all. Captured by the Teashid tribe, he is imprisoned in a wooden collar called a kang, a device so heavy and cumbersome that escape seems impossible. But on the night of a great feast, when his captors are drunk and careless, Temujin strikes down his guard with the very collar that was meant to break him. He disappears into the darkness, and from that night forward, he understands that survival means becoming more ruthless than those who would destroy you. Years pass, and the boy becomes a man, gathering followers through a combination of charisma and calculated violence. He learns to read the hearts of men, to exploit their fears and desires. When he needs allies, he can be generous beyond measure. When he faces opposition, he can be crueler than the winter winds. This is not the random brutality of a madman, but the deliberate cultivation of terror as a weapon more powerful than any sword. By 1206, through a series of brutal campaigns that see entire tribes wiped from existence, Temujin has united the Mongol clans under his rule. At a great gathering called a Kurultai, he is proclaimed Genghis Khan, which means universal ruler. The shamans declare that the eternal blue sky has given him a mandate to conquer the world. What they do not say is that this mandate comes with a price paid in rivers of blood. Genghis Khan understood something that would make modern psychologists shudder. Fear is more powerful than any army. Long before his warriors appeared on the horizon, his reputation preceded him like a plague, spreading panic and despair across entire continents. This was not an accident, but a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological warfare that began with his very first conquests. The Khan's method was deceptively simple. Make the cost of resistance so horrifying that surrender becomes the only rational choice. But surrender was never a guarantee of mercy. Genghis Khan perfected a system where submission might save your life, but defiance meant not just your death, but the complete erasure of everything you had ever loved. Consider the siege of Otrar in 1219, where this philosophy first revealed its full horror to the civilized world. The city's governor, Inalhuk, had made the fatal mistake of killing Mongol merchants and confiscating their goods. When Genghis Khan's messenger arrived demanding justice, Inalhuk killed him too, and sent his head back to the Khan. This act of defiance would cost not just Otrar, but the entire Khwarezmid Empire over 1 million lives. The Mongols arrived at Otrar's gates like a force of nature, but instead of immediately attacking, they waited. For days, the defenders watched from their walls as more and more Mongol warriors appeared, until the plains around their city were black with soldiers and horses. The psychological pressure was unbearable. Children cried constantly. Adults stared into space with haunted eyes. The very air seemed thick with dread. When the attack finally came, it was not the wild charge that many expected, but a systematic, methodical destruction. The Mongols had perfected siege warfare by studying and incorporating the techniques of every civilization they had conquered. Chinese engineers showed them how to build trebuchets and catapults. Persian architects revealed the weak points in fortifications. Muslim scholars taught them about Greek fire and explosive devices. But it was not just the walls of Otrar that fell, it was the spirit of its people. The Mongols had a terrifying practice. They would capture residents from the suburbs and surrounding villages, and drive them ahead of their army as human shields. Imagine watching from the city walls as your neighbors, your relatives, your friends are forced to carry ladders and tools for the very army that seeks to destroy you. Every arrow you shoot, every stone you drop, might kill someone you love. When Otrar finally fell after a 5-month siege, Governor Inalhuk was brought before Genghis Khan. The Khan had prepared a special fate for the man who had dared defy him. Molten silver was poured into Inalhuk's eyes and ears, killing him slowly while the Khan watched with the same expression he might wear while observing the weather. But Inalhuk's death was merciful compared to what happened to his city. Every living soul in Otrar was driven out onto the plains. Then the Mongols divided them into groups. The artisans and craftsmen were spared to be taken as slaves to serve the empire. The women were distributed among the warriors. The children were evaluated, with the taller ones killed immediately, as they might grow up to seek revenge. The shorter ones were enslaved, and all the men were killed, one by one, methodically, while their families watched. But even this was not the end of Otrar's agony. The city itself was dismantled, stone by stone, brick by brick, until nothing remained but bare earth. The irrigation canals were destroyed, the wells filled with corpses and rubble. The very ground was salted to ensure that nothing would ever grow there again. Otrar was not just conquered, it was erased from existence, as if it had never been. News of Otrar's fate spread faster than any army could march. Cities across the Khwarezmid Empire learned that resistance meant not just death, but complete annihilation. This was precisely what Genghis Khan intended. He was waging war not just against armies, but against the very will to resist. What made Genghis Khan truly terrifying was not his cruelty, but his efficiency. Under his rule, the Mongols transformed warfare from a chaotic clash of armies into a precise science of destruction. Every aspect of their military machine was designed to maximize psychological impact while minimizing their own losses. The Mongol army moved like a coordinated organism across the landscape. Each Tumen, a unit of 10,000 warriors, was divided into smaller groups that could operate independently while remaining in constant communication through an elaborate system of signals using flags, horns, and smoke. When they appeared on the battlefield, it was not as a mob of barbarians, but as a perfectly orchestrated instrument of death. Their horses were their greatest weapon, but not in the way most people imagine. Each Mongol warrior maintained 4 or 5 horses, allowing them to cover impossible distances without rest. They could appear hundreds of miles from where they were last seen, striking before their enemies even knew they were in danger. But it was what they did with this mobility that revealed the true depths of their calculated cruelty. The Mongols perfected what they called the feigned retreat, a tactic that exploited human psychology in the most ruthless way imaginable. They would attack a city or army, fight fiercely for a time, and then suddenly break ranks and flee in apparent panic. The defenders, believing they had won a great victory, would pour out of their fortifications in pursuit, abandoning their defensive positions in the excitement of what seemed like certain triumph. This is when the trap would spring. Hidden Mongol forces would emerge from concealment, while the fleeing warriors would wheel their horses around with practiced precision. The pursuers would find themselves surrounded in open ground, cut off from safety, facing fresh troops while they themselves were exhausted from the chase. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter. At the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, this tactic destroyed a massive coalition of Russian princes and Cuman warriors. Over 80,000 men rode out believing they were chasing a defeated enemy. Less than 1 in 10 returned home. The princes themselves were captured alive and subjected to a fate that became a signature of Mongol psychological warfare. The Mongol commanders had a wooden platform constructed, and the captured princes were tied beneath it, still alive. Then the Mongols held their victory feast on top of the platform, slowly crushing the princes to death under the weight while they ate and celebrated above. The symbolism was deliberate and terrifying. The old order was literally being crushed beneath the foundation of the new Mongol world. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Mongol warfare was their intelligence network. They employed merchants, travelers, and captured scholars to gather detailed information about their targets long before any army appeared. They knew the layout of cities, the strength of garrisons, the personalities of leaders, and most importantly, they knew exactly which psychological pressures would be most effective against each opponent. When they besieged the city of Kiev in 1240, they positioned their siege engines so that the thunder of their catapults could be heard throughout the city day and night. They did not just bombard the walls, they bombarded the minds of the defenders, creating a constant state of terror that wore down resistance more effectively than any physical assault. The Mongols also pioneered the use of terror as a strategic weapon. They would deliberately leave survivors from some battles, making sure these witnesses spread tales of Mongol atrocities to the next city on their path. These stories would grow in the telling, becoming ever more horrifying, until the very approach of a Mongol army could cause entire populations to flee without fighting. This psychological warfare was so effective that by the time the Mongols reached Eastern Europe, many cities surrendered immediately upon seeing Mongol banners on the horizon. The mere possibility of resistance had been systematically eliminated through calculated terror. The true genius of Genghis Khan's war machine lay not in its brutality, but in its adaptability. The Mongols began as nomadic herders who had never seen a city wall. Yet within a generation they had become the most sophisticated siege engineers in the world. This transformation was achieved through a system of forced learning that was as brilliant as it was ruthless. When the Mongols conquered the Jin dynasty's border fortresses in northern China, they encountered military technology that seemed impossibly advanced. Massive walls, sophisticated catapults, crossbows that could pierce any armor, and gunpowder weapons that seemed like magic to men who had known only swords and arrows. Rather than retreat in the face of this superior technology, Genghis Khan did something that revealed his true strategic brilliance. He conscripted the very engineers who had built these defenses. Chinese siege engineers were not killed with the other defenders. Instead, they were given a choice that was not really a choice at all: serve the Mongols and live in relative comfort, or watch their families die slowly while they themselves were kept alive to witness every moment of their agony. Most chose to serve, and thus the Mongols acquired not just advanced military technology, but the knowledge of how to improve upon it. But the Mongols did not simply copy what they learned. They refined it, enhanced it, and turned it into something even more terrifying. Chinese catapults were powerful, but Mongol engineers modified them to launch not just stones, but the severed heads of captured defenders, plague-infected corpses, and containers filled with burning naphtha that would spread fire throughout a besieged city. The siege of Baghdad in 1258 showcased this evolution of Mongol warfare in its most horrifying form. The city was the jewel of the Islamic world, home to the House of Wisdom where scholars from across the known world came to study. Its walls had never fallen to any enemy. Its caliph believed that Allah would surely protect the center of the faithful. Hulagu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, arrived at Baghdad's gates with an army that included not just Mongol warriors, but Chinese engineers, Persian siege specialists, and even European crusaders who had joined the Mongol cause. They brought with them weapons that the defenders of Baghdad could not have imagined in their worst nightmares. The Mongols had perfected a type of catapult that could launch projectiles weighing over 300 pounds with devastating accuracy. But they did not use these weapons to simply batter down walls. Instead, they targeted specific buildings within the city: the Grand Mosque, the Caliph's palace, schools, and hospitals. The message was clear: not just the city's defenses, but its entire civilization was under attack. For 37 days, the bombardment continued without pause. The noise alone drove many of the city's inhabitants mad. Children who had never known silence became catatonic. Adults began to hallucinate. The city's famous libraries, containing centuries of accumulated human knowledge, were set ablaze by incendiary projectiles. When Baghdad finally fell, what followed was perhaps the most systematic destruction of a center of learning in human history. The Mongols drove the city's entire population out into the fields, then divided them according to their terrible calculus of usefulness. The scholars and scribes, the very men who had made Baghdad the intellectual capital of the world, were deemed worthless and executed en masse. Their books were thrown into the Tigris River in such quantities that chroniclers reported the water ran black with ink for days. But the destruction of Baghdad revealed another aspect of Mongol psychological warfare: the deliberate targeting of what a civilization held most sacred. They understood that defeating an army only conquered the body of a nation, but destroying its cultural and religious centers conquered its soul. The Caliph himself, the spiritual leader of millions of Muslims, was sewn into a carpet and trampled to death by Mongol horses. This method of execution was chosen specifically because Islamic law forbade the spilling of royal blood directly. The Mongols showed that they understood their enemies' beliefs well enough to pervert them into instruments of psychological torture. This pattern repeated across the Mongol Empire. In each conquered land, they identified what the local population held most dear, then systematically destroyed it in the most psychologically damaging way possible. Christian churches were turned into stables for Mongol horses. Buddhist temples were dismantled, and their stones used to build latrines. Islamic madrasas were converted into slaughterhouses. The message was always the same: your civilization, your culture, your gods. Everything you believe makes you superior to us. We will prove worthless. The only power that matters is the power to destroy, and we possess it in absolute measure. By 1220, the Mongol Empire had developed what can only be described as an industrial approach to conquest and terror. Genghis Khan's armies moved across the map like a natural disaster, but one guided by cruel intelligence rather than blind force. Each campaign was planned with meticulous attention to maximizing psychological impact across the widest possible area. The conquest of the Khwarezmid Empire demonstrated this strategy in its full, horrifying scope. Rather than concentrating his forces for a single decisive battle, Genghis Khan divided his army into multiple columns, each targeting a different region simultaneously. This created the impression that the Mongols were everywhere at once, an omnipresent force of destruction that could not be escaped or defeated. One column, led by Jib and Sabbatai, pursued the fleeing Khwarezm Shah Muhammad II across Persia and into the Caspian region. Their mission was not primarily to capture the Shah, though they pursued him relentlessly, but to spread terror throughout the Persian heartland. City after city fell before them, each destruction carefully calibrated to send a message to the next target. At Nishapur, the Mongols encountered fierce resistance. The city's defenders, believing they were making a heroic stand, fought with desperate courage. They even managed to kill Tukuka, one of Genghis Khan's sons-in-law, with a well-aimed arrow from the city walls. This act of defiance would cost Nishapur everything. When the city finally fell, Genghis Khan's daughter, Tukucha's widow, was given the honor of deciding the fate of its population. Her choice revealed the depths of Mongol cruelty. Every living creature in the city was to be killed, including cats, dogs, and even insects. The soldiers were ordered to cut off the heads of all the corpses and pile them in pyramids outside the city gates, separated by gender. Men's heads in one pyramid, women's in another, children's in a third. But even this was not sufficient revenge. The Mongols returned to Nishapur after the slaughter and examined the corpses one by one, cutting open their stomachs to ensure that no one had survived by feigning death. They then demolished every building in the city, diverted the rivers that fed its irrigation system, and scattered the rubble so thoroughly that later travelers could not even determine where the city had once stood. This was not random destruction born of rage, but calculated theater designed to send a message across the entire Islamic world. The pyramids of heads were visible for miles, serving as monuments to the cost of resistance. Travelers and refugees carried word of what they had seen to every corner of the known world, ensuring that Nishapur's fate became a story told in whispers around countless fires. Meanwhile, other Mongol columns were conducting similar operations across Central Asia, at Merv. Once known as the Pearl of the World, the population was counted before execution. Each Mongol soldier was assigned a quota of people to kill, with officers verifying the count by examining piles of severed ears. The total came to over 700,000 souls. making Merv's destruction one of the largest single massacres in human history. At Herat, the Mongols employed a different psychological strategy. They spared the city initially, accepting its surrender and establishing a small garrison. But when the population rose up and killed the Mongol governors, retribution came with mathematical precision. The Mongols returned and killed exactly half the population, leaving the survivors to live with the knowledge that their neighbors' deaths were the price of their own brief rebellion. These tactics created a climate of terror that extended far beyond the boundaries of the Mongol Empire itself. European chronicles from this period speak of strange atmospheric phenomena, unusual animal behavior, and widespread reports of prophetic dreams foretelling the end of the world. While these accounts reflect medieval superstition, they also capture something real: the psychological impact of knowing that somewhere beyond the horizon, an unstoppable force of destruction was systematically erasing entire civilizations. The Mongols understood that fear travels faster than armies, and they used this principle to conquer territories before their soldiers ever set foot there. Cities would surrender at the first sight of Mongol scouts, preferring the uncertainty of mercy to the certainty of the alternative. One of the most chilling aspects of Genghis Khan's legacy was how efficiently he transmitted his methods to his sons and grandsons. The second generation of Mongol leaders did not merely inherit an empire. They inherited a complete system for generating and utilizing terror that they refined and expanded with coldly scientific precision. Genghis Khan, Genghis's third son and chosen successor, understood that maintaining an empire built on fear required constant demonstration of that fear's validity. Under his rule, the Mongol war machine evolved from a tool of conquest into an instrument of systematic intimidation, designed to prevent rebellion across vast distances. When the city of Kaifeng in northern China attempted to negotiate rather than surrender immediately, Gedei's response revealed how thoroughly he had absorbed his father's lessons. The siege lasted over a year, not because the Mongols lacked the ability to take the city quickly, but because Gedei wanted every person in China to hear about Kaifeng's suffering in exquisite detail. The Mongols constructed a ring of fortifications around Kaifeng, effectively creating a prison from which no one could escape. Then they waited, allowing starvation and disease to do their work. Reports filtered out through desperate messengers about conditions inside the city: parents eating their own children, the streets piled high with corpses, survivors reduced to gnawing on leather and tree bark. When Kaifeng finally surrendered, its population had been reduced from over 1 million to fewer than 100,000. But Gedei's psychological masterstroke came in how he treated these survivors. Rather than executing them, he relocated them across the empire, separating families and scattering them to distant regions where they would serve as living testaments to the cost of resistance. Every Chinese city heard first-hand accounts from Kaifeng refugees, ensuring that no other city would dare attempt negotiation. Batakhan, Genghis's grandson, brought these refined terror tactics to Eastern Europe with devastating effect. His invasion of Kievan Rus and Hungary demonstrated how the Mongols had learned to tailor their psychological warfare to different cultural contexts, while maintaining its essential ruthlessness. In Russia, Batu understood that the Orthodox Christian population placed enormous spiritual significance on their churches and religious artifacts. Rather than simply destroying these buildings, he turned them into stages for elaborate blasphemies designed to shatter the faith of survivors. Priests were forced to burn their own holy books. Icons were used as targets for archery practice. Churches were filled with animal carcasses and left to rot, creating a stench of death that could be smelled for miles. At the siege of Moscow, Batu employed a psychological tactic that had never been used before in European warfare. He captured the city's Prince Yuri and had him brought to the walls, where the defenders could see him clearly. Then, in full view of his subjects, the prince was slowly flayed alive, his screams echoing across the city for hours. The message was unmistakable. Your leaders cannot protect you, and the social order you depend upon is nothing more than an illusion. But perhaps the most sophisticated psychological campaign was conducted by Hulagu Khan during his conquest of the Islamic world. Hulagu understood that Islam placed particular emphasis on the concept of divine protection for the faithful, and he systematically set out to destroy this belief. At Aleppo, Hulagu ordered his engineers to construct enormous catapults directly adjacent to the city's Grand Mosque. These siege engines did not target the city's walls, but fired continuously into the mosque itself, reducing it to rubble while the city's defenders watched helplessly from their fortifications. The symbolism was deliberate. Allah cannot protect his own house. How can he protect you? When Aleppo fell, Hulagu gathered the city's religious leaders and forced them to watch while their libraries were burned and their students executed. Then he presented them with a choice: renounce Islam and convert to Christianity, or join their followers in death. Most chose death, but Hulagu made sure that those who converted were kept alive and sent to other Islamic cities to spread word of their apostasy. This strategy of targeting religious faith itself was perhaps the most insidious aspect of Mongol psychological warfare. They understood that breaking an army only conquered the body, but breaking faith conquered the soul. Across the Islamic world, the approach of Mongol armies was preceded by a crisis of faith, as people struggled to understand how Allah could permit such horrors to befall the faithful. The children of Genghis Khan had learned their father's lessons well. Terror was not an unfortunate byproduct of conquest, but its most essential tool. They refined his methods, systematized his cruelties, and expanded his empire not just across geographical boundaries, but into the realm of the human psyche itself. What made Mongol psychological warfare so devastatingly effective was not just its cruelty, but its intelligence. The Mongols developed what can only be described as an empirical approach to terror, carefully observing which methods produced the desired results and refining their techniques accordingly. Genghis Khan established a practice that his successors continued throughout the empire's expansion: the systematic interrogation of survivors. After each conquest, selected prisoners were questioned extensively about their city's destruction. What had frightened them most? What had broken their will to resist? Which specific actions had convinced them that surrender was preferable to death? These interviews were not conducted out of curiosity, but as a form of military research. The Mongols maintained detailed records of which psychological techniques were most effective against different types of opponents. They learned that Chinese populations, with their emphasis on ancestor worship, were particularly devastated by the desecration of burial grounds. Islamic societies, with their strict codes regarding the treatment of women, could be broken by the systematic rape of captured females in public view. Christian communities, focused on the sanctity of religious authority, collapsed when their priests were forced to participate in blasphemous acts. This systematic approach to terror reached its most sophisticated form under the administration of Genghis Khan, Genghis's grandson, who ruled from 1251 to 1259. Genghis established what he called the Bureau of Fear, a formal government department tasked with developing and implementing psychological warfare techniques across the empire. The Bureau maintained extensive files on the cultural, religious, and psychological characteristics of every known population within Mongol territory and beyond. When planning a campaign, Mongol commanders would consult these files to determine which specific terror tactics would be most effective against their intended targets. This was psychological warfare elevated to the level of science. For example, when planning the invasion of Japan, the Bureau's analysis indicated that Japanese society placed extraordinary emphasis on personal honor and the shame of defeat. Based on this assessment, Mongol commanders developed a strategy specifically designed to maximize humiliation rather than simple destruction. The first Mongol invasion fleet, launched in 1274, carried not just weapons and soldiers, but carefully prepared psychological warfare materials. They brought banners inscribed with Japanese writing that proclaimed the cowardice and worthlessness of Japanese warriors. They carried captured Japanese weapons that had been deliberately broken and defiled. Most disturbingly, they brought the severed heads of Japanese fishermen and coastal villagers, preserved in salt, to be catapulted into Japanese fortifications. When Mongol forces landed on the Japanese coast, they did not immediately attack the samurai defenders. Instead, they arranged their captured heads on pikes facing the Japanese lines, then performed elaborate mock battles using captured Japanese armor and weapons, demonstrating their contempt for Japanese martial traditions. Only after this psychological preparation did they launch their actual assault. Although the invasion ultimately failed due to adverse weather conditions that the Japanese called kamikaze or divine wind, the psychological impact on Japan was profound and lasting. Japanese chronicles from this period describe a national crisis of confidence that persisted for generations, with many warriors questioning whether their traditional values and methods could stand against such alien forms of warfare. The Bureau of Fear also developed techniques for maintaining terror within already conquered populations. They established a network of informants whose job was not primarily to gather intelligence about potential rebellions, but to spread carefully crafted rumors designed to maintain a state of perpetual anxiety. These rumors were not random, but carefully targeted to exploit specific cultural fears. In Christian territories, stories circulated about Mongol shamans who could raise the dead and command demons. In Islamic regions, tales spread of Mongol leaders who claimed to be prophets superior to Muhammad. In Buddhist areas, rumors described Mongol practices that supposedly granted immortality through the consumption of human flesh. The genius of this system was that it was largely self-sustaining. People frightened by these rumors would modify their own behavior, often in ways that were more restrictive than anything the Mongols had actually demanded. Parents would refuse to let children play outside. Merchants would avoid traveling to markets. Religious observances would be conducted in secret, underground, even when no Mongol authority had forbidden them. This self-imposed isolation made rebellion practically impossible, as potential conspirators were too afraid to trust each other with subversive plans. The Mongols had created a system where their subjects terrorized themselves more effectively than any occupying army could manage. The true measure of Genghis Khan's psychological warfare was not in the immediate destruction it caused, but in the way it altered human consciousness itself. The Mongol conquests did not just redraw maps. They rewrote the fundamental assumptions about what one group of humans could do to another. Before the Mongols' warfare, however brutal, generally followed certain unspoken rules. Cities might be sacked, but they were not systematically erased from existence. Populations might be enslaved, but they were not methodically categorized for extermination based on their potential future usefulness. Religious sites might be destroyed, but not as part of a calculated campaign to destroy the very concept of the sacred. The Mongols broke all these unspoken rules simultaneously, and in doing so, they introduced concepts of systematic destruction that would echo through the darkest chapters of human history. They demonstrated that it was possible to organize slaughter on an industrial scale, to reduce the taking of human life to a matter of administrative efficiency. The psychological scars left by Mongol conquests can be traced through centuries of subsequent history. The Russian concept of the Mongol yoke became a defining trauma that shaped Russian political culture for generations. The Chinese developed elaborate philosophical systems focused on the restoration of order, specifically as a response to the chaos the Mongols had introduced. Islamic scholars wrote extensively about the theological implications of Allah permitting such destruction of the faithful. But perhaps the most chilling legacy of Mongol psychological warfare was how it provided a template for future atrocities. The systematic nature of Mongol terror, the careful categorization of victims, the use of bureaucratic efficiency to organize mass death. All these elements would reappear in the genocides of the 20th century. Adolf Hitler himself acknowledged Genghis Khan as an inspiration, famously asking, "Who today remembers the Armenians?" while pointing to the Mongol extermination of entire peoples as proof that even the most massive atrocities could be forgotten if they were thorough enough. The Nazi concept of Lebensraum, the idea that superior peoples had the right to exterminate inferior populations to claim their territory, was explicitly modeled on Mongol practices. Stalin's forced famines in Ukraine and Kazakhstan employed the same basic strategy the Mongols had used: the systematic destruction of a population's ability to sustain itself, combined with the prevention of escape or outside aid. The Khmer Rouge in Cambodia adopted Mongol techniques of destroying urban populations by forcing them into agricultural labor under impossible conditions. In each case, these later atrocities incorporated refinements of psychological warfare techniques that the Mongols had pioneered. The use of terror not just to defeat enemies, but to reshape entire societies. The systematic destruction of cultural and religious institutions. The careful categorization of victims to maximize the psychological impact of their deaths. The Mongol Empire collapsed within a few generations of Genghis Khan's death. But the psychological techniques they developed proved far more durable than their political structures. They had discovered something fundamental about human nature: that properly applied terror could not only defeat armies and topple governments, but could reach into the deepest levels of human consciousness and remain there, shaping behavior and belief for centuries to come. This is perhaps Genghis Khan's most terrifying legacy. He proved that it was possible to weaponize fear itself, to create trauma so profound that it would be passed down through generations like a genetic inheritance. The screams that echoed across the steppes 800 years ago have never really stopped. They have simply taken new forms, found new voices, and continued their work of teaching humanity the depths of cruelty of which it is capable. To understand the true scope of Genghis Khan's psychological warfare, one must grapple with the numbers, though numbers alone cannot capture the full horror of what transpired. Modern historians estimate that the Mongol conquests reduced the global population by as much as 11%, a demographic catastrophe comparable to the Black Death or the destruction of the Americas by European diseases. But these statistics, staggering as they are, do not tell the complete story. The Mongols did not simply kill large numbers of people. They killed them in ways specifically designed to maximize psychological trauma for survivors and spread terror to unconquered populations. They turned death itself into a weapon of war. Consider the fate of Urgench, the capital of Khwarezmia, and one of the greatest trading cities in Central Asia. When the city fell after a siege lasting several months, Genghis Khan ordered his forces to systematically dismantle not just the city's defenses, but its entire infrastructure. The irrigation canals that had sustained agriculture in the region for over 1,000 years were filled with stones and corpses. The dams that controlled seasonal flooding were destroyed. The reservoirs were poisoned with rotting bodies. But the destruction of Urgench went beyond even this systematic obliteration of the city's physical existence. Genghis Khan ordered that the site be ploughed under and planted with barley, symbolically erasing it from the category of human habitation and returning it to a state of nature. Travelers passing through the region decades later could not even locate where the city had once stood, though they could still find human bones protruding from the soil after spring rains. This practice of not just destroying cities, but erasing them from existence, became a signature of Mongol psychological warfare. They understood that the complete disappearance of major population centers created a specific type of terror, the fear that one's entire civilization could simply cease to exist, leaving no trace that it had ever been. The Mongols also perfected techniques for maximizing the psychological impact of mass executions. At the siege of Zhongdu, modern Beijing, they developed a system for processing prisoners that was designed to be as traumatic as possible for both the victims and any witnesses who might survive to tell the tale. Prisoners were not simply killed en masse, but were forced to participate in their own destruction through a series of choices that ensured psychological torment regardless of what they decided. Families were brought forward together and told that one member could be spared if they personally executed the others. Those who refused were tortured to death slowly while their loved ones watched. Those who complied were then told they had proven themselves unworthy to live and were killed anyway. Children were separated from their parents and given weapons, then forced to fight each other while the adults watched. The survivors of these combat trials were not rewarded with life, but were instead given the task of executing their own parents as proof of their loyalty to the new Mongol order. This systematic destruction of family bonds served not just to eliminate potential resistance, but to break down the social structures that gave meaning to human existence. The psychological sophistication of these methods becomes even more apparent when we examine how the Mongols adapted their techniques to different cultural contexts. When conquering Islamic territories, they would force Muslim prisoners to eat pork and drink wine before execution, ensuring that their victims believed they were dying in a state of sin. When destroying Buddhist monasteries, they would compel monks to break their vows of celibacy before being killed, convincing them that they were forfeiting any chance of enlightenment in future lives. These were not the random cruelties of undisciplined soldiers, but carefully planned operations designed to attack not just the body, but the soul. The Mongols had discovered that physical death was only the beginning of the terror they could inflict. The real weapon was the destruction of hope, faith, and meaning itself. One of the most ingenious aspects of Mongol psychological warfare was how they turned the medieval world's communication networks against itself. The same trade routes that carried silk and spices also carried stories, and the Mongols learned to use these narratives as weapons more devastating than any siege engine. Genghis Khan established a practice that his successors refined into a systematic campaign of narrative warfare. After each conquest, they would deliberately spare certain types of people: merchants, travelers, scholars, and religious pilgrims. These survivors were not shown mercy out of compassion, but because they served a specific strategic function. They were living messengers designed to spread carefully crafted accounts of Mongol capabilities. But these were not simple tales of military victory. The stories that spread along the Silk Road were precisely calibrated to create maximum psychological impact on specific audiences. Merchants carried accounts of Mongol armies that moved faster than the wind, appearing in multiple cities hundreds of miles apart on the same day. Religious pilgrims spoke of Mongol shamans who could command the weather, summon demons, and speak with the dead. The Mongols understood that in medieval societies, supernatural explanations were more terrifying than natural ones. An army that could be defeated through superior tactics or greater numbers was one thing. An army that commanded supernatural forces was quite another. By encouraging supernatural interpretations of their abilities, the Mongols transformed themselves from a military threat into an apocalyptic force. These narrative campaigns were coordinated across vast distances with remarkable precision. The same basic stories would appear simultaneously in markets from Constantinople to Kiev to Baghdad, but adapted to local cultural contexts. Christian merchants would describe Mongol leaders as demonic figures sent to punish the faithful for their sins. Muslim traders would speak of Mongol sorcerers who had corrupted the natural order. Buddhist pilgrims would tell of Mongol armies accompanied by hungry ghosts and demons. The cumulative effect of this narrative warfare was to create a climate of supernatural dread that extended far beyond the physical boundaries of Mongol conquests. Regions that had never seen a Mongol warrior lived in constant fear of their arrival, often making political and military decisions based on the assumption that resistance was not just futile, but blasphemous. Perhaps the most sophisticated example of this narrative warfare was the campaign conducted before the invasion of Eastern Europe. 4 years before Batur Khan's armies crossed the Carpathian Mountains, carefully chosen survivors from previous campaigns had been spreading stories throughout the region about the coming of the Scourge of God. These stories did not focus on military details, but on theological implications. The Mongols were described not as conquerors, but as instruments of divine judgment sent to punish Christianity for its failings. This interpretation was particularly devastating because it suggested that resistance was not just hopeless, but sinful, an act of defiance against God's will. When Mongol armies finally appeared on the borders of Hungary and Poland, they found populations that were already psychologically defeated. Many cities surrendered without fighting, their leaders convinced that they were witnessing the end times and that submission was their only hope for salvation. Others engaged in mass religious displays of penance, believing that if they could prove their piety, God might spare them from the coming destruction. The Mongols had achieved something unprecedented in medieval warfare. They had conquered territories before their armies ever arrived, using nothing but carefully crafted stories carried by survivors of previous campaigns. The physical structures that the Mongols built during their conquests were as much instruments of psychological warfare as they were practical military installations. Every fortress, every administrative center, every monument they erected was designed to communicate a specific message about the nature of Mongol power and the futility of resistance. The most notorious of these structures were the pyramid monuments built from the skulls and bones of conquered populations. These were not crude piles of remains thrown together in the heat of victory, but carefully engineered monuments designed to last for generations. The skulls were sorted by size and arranged in precise geometric patterns. The bones were assembled into walls using mortar made from lime and human fat. The entire structure was then covered with a lime wash that preserved it against weather and decay. These pyramids served multiple psychological functions simultaneously. For survivors of the conquered population, they were permanent reminders of the cost of resistance, visible landmarks that could be seen from miles away and would endure long after the immediate trauma of conquest had faded. For visitors from unconquered territories, they served as warnings of what awaited those who dared oppose Mongol power. But perhaps most importantly, these monuments served as proof of Mongol claims about their supernatural abilities. To medieval minds accustomed to thinking in terms of divine judgment and cosmic order, the systematic construction of monuments from human remains suggested powers that transcended normal military capabilities. Only beings with supernatural authority could transform the sacred substance of human bodies into architectural materials. The Mongols also understood the psychological power of architectural symbolism, and they deliberately incorporated elements designed to maximize cultural trauma. When they conquered Chinese cities, they would build their administrative centers directly on top of destroyed Confucian temples, symbolically demonstrating the replacement of Chinese civilization with Mongol order. In Islamic territories, they would construct stables and latrines adjacent to mosques, forcing the faithful to witness the daily defilement of their sacred spaces. The city of Karakoram, Genghis Khan's capital, was itself a masterpiece of psychological architecture. Rather than building a traditional Mongol settlement of felt tents, Genghis Khan commissioned a permanent city that incorporated architectural elements from every conquered civilization. Chinese pagodas stood next to Islamic minarets. Christian churches were built adjacent to Buddhist temples. Persian gardens surrounded Mongol administrative buildings. But this was not a celebration of cultural diversity. It was a deliberate demonstration that all human civilizations were equally subordinate to Mongol power. The architectural styles that represented the highest achievements of different cultures were reduced to decorative elements in a Mongol imperial display. The message was unmistakable. Your greatest monuments, your most sacred buildings, your most sophisticated artistic traditions, all of these are nothing more than trophies in our collection. The psychological impact of this architectural strategy extended far beyond the immediate visual effect. Diplomats and merchants who visited Karakoram returned to their home territories with detailed descriptions of how their own cultural achievements had been incorporated into Mongol imperial displays. These accounts served as reminders that no civilization, however ancient or sophisticated, was immune to Mongol conquest and subordination. The most disturbing aspect of Mongol psychological warfare was not its scale or its cruelty, but its systematic nature. Under Genghis Khan's leadership, the Mongols developed what can only be described as an industrial approach to terror, complete with standardized procedures, quality control measures, and efficiency metrics. The decimal system that organized Mongol armies into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 was applied not just to military organization, but to the processing of conquered populations. Each unit commander was assigned specific quotas for different categories of captives. So many skilled artisans to be spared. So many young women to be distributed among the warriors. So many children to be evaluated for potential military service. So many adult males to be executed. These quotas were not arbitrary numbers, but carefully calculated figures based on the Mongols' analysis of optimal terrain-utility ratios. They had determined through extensive experience that killing approximately 70 to 90% of a conquered population created maximum psychological impact while preserving sufficient survivors to spread word of the destruction to neighboring territories. The remaining 10 to 30% were processed according to equally systematic criteria. Physical characteristics were evaluated with scientific precision. Height, weight, age, and general health were recorded and used to determine each individual's potential usefulness to the Mongol war machine. Skills were assessed through practical tests. Blacksmiths were required to demonstrate their abilities. Engineers were tested on their knowledge of siege techniques. Linguists were evaluated on their fluency in multiple languages. But even this utilitarian approach to human life served psychological purposes beyond mere efficiency. The systematic evaluation of prisoners created a climate of desperate hope among the conquered that often proved more psychologically devastating than simple execution would have been. Families were separated and processed individually, never knowing whether their loved ones had been selected for survival or death. This uncertainty prolonged psychological agony far beyond the immediate trauma of conquest. The Mongols also developed standardized techniques for breaking the spirits of those selected for survival. Skilled artisans who were spared death were immediately put to work creating weapons and siege engines that would be used against their own people in future campaigns. Engineers were forced to design fortifications that would then be tested against their own defensive strategies. Scholars and scribes were compelled to write propaganda documents praising Mongol virtues, while denouncing the cowardice and worthlessness of their former rulers. These practices served multiple functions within the Mongol system of psychological warfare. They eliminated potential sources of technical knowledge that could be used against future Mongol campaigns. They provided the empire with skilled labor that could be deployed in subsequent conquests. But most importantly, they created a class of collaborators whose very existence served as proof of the futility of resistance. When unconquered populations learned that their own people were actively participating in Mongol military campaigns, the psychological impact was often more devastating than news of military defeats. It suggested that even those who survived Mongol conquest were so thoroughly broken that they would turn against their own kind. This knowledge created a sense of inevitable betrayal that made coordinated resistance almost impossible to organize. By 1227, when Genghis Khan died, the Mongol Empire had fundamentally altered the psychological landscape of the known world. The traditional assumptions that had governed human societies for millennia, the unspoken agreements about the limits of acceptable behavior in warfare, the religious and cultural beliefs that provided meaning and structure to human existence. All of these had been systematically destroyed and replaced with a new understanding of what one group of humans could do to another. The death of Genghis Khan did not end this psychological transformation. It accelerated it. His successors understood that maintaining the empire their father had built required continuous demonstration of the terror that had created it. They refined his methods, expanded his territories, and systematized his cruelties until the mere existence of the Mongol Empire served as a permanent threat to every human society on Earth. Under Genghis Khan, the Mongol Empire reached its greatest territorial extent, stretching from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, encompassing nearly 25% of the world's inhabited land. But more than geography, the Mongols had conquered something far more fundamental. They had conquered the human imagination itself. Across this vast territory, populations lived with the constant awareness that their continued existence depended entirely on Mongol sufferance. Cities that had never seen Mongol warriors modified their behavior based on reports from distant territories. Rulers made political decisions designed to avoid attracting Mongol attention. Religious leaders altered their teachings to accommodate the possibility that the traditional gods might have been displaced by Mongol shamanic powers. This psychological dominance was maintained through a sophisticated system of reminders and reinforcements. Mongol administrators would periodically organize mass executions in conquered territories, not because rebellion threatened, but simply to remind populations of their subordinate status. These killings followed the same systematic procedures that had been developed during the initial conquests. Careful selection of victims based on their potential psychological impact. Precise methods of execution designed to maximize trauma for witnesses, and systematic documentation of results for use in future operations. The Mongols had discovered that terror, like any other resource, required regular harvesting to maintain its effectiveness. Fear that was allowed to fade through time became nostalgia. Fear that was regularly reinforced became a permanent condition of human existence. Perhaps the most chilling evidence of this psychological transformation can be found in the literature and historical records of the period. Chronicles from across the conquered territories describe populations that had lost the ability to imagine alternatives to Mongol rule. Writers who had never lived under any other system described Mongol dominance as if it were a natural condition. Like weather or geography, children born in the conquered territories grew up with stories of the time before the Mongols that seemed as remote and fantastical as fairy tales. The idea that human societies could exist without systematic terror, that cities could be built without the constant threat of total destruction, that families could remain together without fear of arbitrary separation, these concepts became increasingly difficult for people to comprehend. The Mongols had achieved something unprecedented in human history. They had created a form of psychological domination so complete that their subjects began to lose the ability to conceive of freedom itself. When the Mongol Empire finally began to fragment in the late 13th century, the immediate threat of Mongol conquest faded from most of the world. The great armies that had once swept across continents were divided among squabbling descendants. The systematic terror apparatus that had maintained control over vast populations gradually deteriorated. Cities began to rebuild, trade routes reopened, and human societies slowly began to recover from the demographic catastrophe of Mongol rule. But the psychological legacy of Genghis Khan and his successors proved far more durable than their political structures. They had introduced concepts and techniques that would echo through the darkest chapters of human history, providing templates for future atrocities that would dwarf even Mongol achievements in their scale and systematic nature. The fundamental insight that Genghis Khan had discovered, that terror could be weaponized and deployed with scientific precision to achieve strategic objectives, became part of humanity's collective knowledge. Future tyrants would study Mongol methods and refine them using modern technology and organizational techniques. The Holocaust, the killing fields of Cambodia, the Rwandan genocide, Stalin's purges, all of these atrocities incorporated elements of systematic terror that the Mongols had pioneered centuries earlier. But beyond these historical parallels, the Mongol conquests left a deeper mark on human consciousness. They proved that civilization itself was far more fragile than most people had believed, that the social structures and cultural institutions that seemed permanent and unshakable could be destroyed in a single generation. This knowledge created a fundamental anxiety that has never entirely disappeared from human societies. The modern world's obsession with security, its constant preparation for worst-case scenarios, its persistent fear that order might suddenly collapse into chaos. All of these can be traced back to the psychological trauma that the Mongols inflicted on human civilization 8 centuries ago. Genghis Khan's armies may have disappeared, but the fear they created has become a permanent part of the human condition. Even today, in our interconnected digital age, the shadow of Mongol psychological warfare can be seen in modern conflicts. The use of social media to spread terror, the systematic targeting of civilian populations to break political will, the deliberate destruction of cultural and religious sites to demoralize enemies. All of these techniques would be immediately recognizable to a Mongol commander from the 13th century. The weapons have changed, the technology has advanced, but the fundamental understanding that fear is more powerful than force, that breaking the human spirit is more effective than breaking human bodies, that terror can be harvested and deployed like any other strategic resource. This knowledge remains as relevant today as it was when Mongol horses first thundered across the steppes. Genghis Khan died 800 years ago, but his greatest victory was not the conquest of territory or the accumulation of wealth. His greatest victory was the conquest of human imagination itself. The the demonstration that there were no limits to what one group of humans could do to another if they were willing to abandon all moral constraints in pursuit of power. This lesson has never been forgotten, and perhaps it never can be. It has become part of humanity's darkest inheritance, passed down through generations, not in books or monuments, but in the deep psychological structures that shape how we understand the possibilities of human behavior. The screams that echoed across medieval battlefields have faded into silence, but the fear they created continues to resonate in the human soul, a permanent reminder of what we are capable of becoming when we choose power over compassion, efficiency over empathy, conquest over coexistence. Tonight, as you prepare to sleep, remember that you live in a world shaped by Genghis Khan's vision of human nature. The stability you take for granted, the laws that protect you, the moral boundaries that constrain behavior, all of these exist in constant tension with the knowledge that they can be swept away as easily as cities on the steppes, leaving nothing behind but pyramids of bone and the eternal silence of those who dared to resist. The Khan is dead, but his shadow falls across eternity, and in that shadow we are all his subjects still, heirs to a legacy of fear that defines what it means to be human in a world where such things are possible. The greatest terror is not that these horrors happened, but that they happened once, which means they can happen again. And in the darkness between sleeping and waking, in the moment when consciousness fades and the barriers between past and present dissolve, you might hear them still, faint but unmistakable, the thunder of hooves, the whisper of arrows, and the voice of history itself, reminding you that some shadows are too dark and too deep ever to fade away. This is the true legacy of Genghis Khan, not the empire that crumbled, not the cities that were rebuilt, not the populations that recovered, but the permanent knowledge that such things are possible, that the human capacity for systematic cruelty knows no bounds, and that somewhere in the darkness of our shared past, the precedent has been set for every horror that has followed, and every horror yet to come. Perhaps no aspect of Mongols' psychological warfare was more calculated or more devastating than their treatment of women and children. Genghis Khan understood that the systematic targeting of the most vulnerable members of society would create trauma that would echo through generations, ensuring that the fear of Mongol conquest would be passed down like a genetic inheritance from mother to child. The Mongol approach to captured women was not the random violence of undisciplined soldiers, but a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to destroy the social fabric of conquered societies. Women were not simply taken as spoils of war. They were processed through a system that was designed to maximize psychological damage to both the women themselves and the communities they came from. When the Mongols conquered a city, women were separated into categories based on age, physical appearance, and social status. Young women of childbearing age were divided among Mongol warriors, but not randomly. The Mongols had observed that forcing women to witness the deaths of their husbands, fathers, and sons before being distributed created a specific type of psychological trauma that made them less likely to resist or attempt escape. But even more sinister was the fate of pregnant women. The Mongols developed a practice of forcing these women to give birth during the siege itself, often in the most degrading circumstances possible. Then, in full view of the defending population, they would present the mothers with a choice: kill their newborn children themselves, or watch while Mongol warriors killed both mother and child in ways too horrible to describe in detail. Most mothers, driven to madness by this impossible decision, would take their children's lives with their own hands. The Mongols would then spare these women, but force them to accompany the army to the next siege, where they would be displayed to the new population as living examples of what Mongol conquest could drive people to do. These broken women, carrying the unbearable weight of infanticide, became walking monuments to the psychological power of Mongol terror. The treatment of children was equally systematic and equally devastating. The Mongols had discovered that different ages of children created different levels of psychological impact when killed in front of their parents. Infants and toddlers, they found, created immediate emotional trauma but did not generate the long-term psychological damage they sought. Older children, however, particularly those old enough to understand what was happening to them, created deeper and more lasting wounds in the adult survivors who witnessed their deaths. The Mongols developed what they called the Wheel of Choosing, a practice where captured families were arranged in circles and forced to decide which of their children would live and which would die. Parents who refused to choose watched as all their children were killed slowly. Those who made the choice were forced to participate in the execution of the children they had condemned, ensuring that they would carry the weight of their decision for the rest of their lives. But the most sophisticated aspect of the Mongol approach to psychological warfare involving families was their understanding of how to use children as weapons against their own parents. Children who were spared death were not shown mercy. They were enrolled in a systematic program designed to turn them against everything their parents had taught them. Young boys were forced to participate in the execution of adult prisoners, starting with criminals and enemies, but gradually progressing to members of their own communities and eventually their own family members. This process was designed to desensitize them to violence while simultaneously destroying their capacity for emotional attachment. By the time these children reached adolescence, they had become perfect instruments of Mongol terror, capable of any atrocity without hesitation or remorse. Girls faced an even more insidious fate. Those selected for survival were trained not just to serve Mongol masters, but to become agents of psychological warfare themselves. They were taught to speak of their former lives with contempt, to praise Mongol customs above those of their birth families, and most devastatingly, to bear children for their Mongol captors, while expressing gratitude for the privilege. When these women were eventually allowed to return to their home communities, often years later, they served as living proof of the completeness of Mongol victory. Their own families would see them praising the very system that had destroyed their lives, bearing children who looked like their conquerors, and speaking of their former culture as if it were primitive and worthless. The psychological impact on the communities that received these returnees was often more devastating than if the women had simply been killed during the original conquest. One of the most chilling aspects of Mongol psychological warfare was the systematic documentation of their atrocities. Genghis Khan established a practice that his successors expanded into a comprehensive bureaucracy of terror, the detailed recording of every aspect of their campaigns, not for historical purposes, but as tools for refining and improving their methods of psychological domination. The Mongols maintained what they called books of fear, detailed records of which terror tactics had proven most effective against different populations. These were not crude tallies of deaths, but sophisticated analyses that included information about cultural vulnerabilities, religious taboos that could be exploited, and specific techniques that had proven most successful at breaking the will to resist. Chinese scholars who were captured during the conquest of the Jin dynasty were forced to serve as scribes for these records, documenting in meticulous detail the very techniques that had been used to destroy their own civilization. They were required to analyze the psychological impact of different forms of torture, to catalogue the effectiveness of various methods of execution, and to recommend improvements to Mongol techniques based on their knowledge of Chinese cultural values. These scholarly collaborators were presented with an impossible choice: contribute their expertise to the Mongol war machine, or watch as their families were subjected to increasingly creative forms of torture. Most chose collaboration, and their contributions to Mongol psychological warfare techniques represented one of history's most disturbing examples of intellectual prostitution. The information contained in these books of fear was not kept secret within the Mongol hierarchy. Instead, selected excerpts were deliberately leaked to populations that had not yet been conquered. Merchants and travelers were allowed to see certain pages, ensuring that stories of Mongol capabilities would spread along trade routes faster than armies could march. These leaked documents served multiple purposes. They provided unconquered populations with detailed descriptions of what awaited them if they resisted, creating terror before any Mongol warrior appeared on their borders. They also established the scientific credibility of Mongol terror methods, suggesting that these were not random acts of cruelty but systematic techniques that had been tested and refined through extensive application. Perhaps most insidiously, these documents created a form of psychological contagion that spread far beyond the immediate reach of Mongol armies. Local rulers, reading about Mongol techniques, would sometimes adopt similar methods against their own populations, reasoning that if such tactics were effective for the Mongols, they might prove useful for maintaining domestic control as well. The Mongols also established a network of what can only be described as terror correspondents, individuals whose primary function was to travel throughout the empire, documenting the long-term psychological effects of Mongol conquest. These agents would visit communities that had been conquered years or decades earlier, interviewing survivors about the lasting impact of their experiences. The information gathered by these correspondents was used to refine Mongol techniques for subsequent campaigns. If certain methods had proven to create lasting trauma that made populations more docile and easier to govern, those techniques would be emphasized in future conquests. If other methods had proven less effective at creating long-term psychological damage, they would be abandoned in favor of more promising approaches. This systematic approach to terror research created a feedback loop that made each Mongol campaign more psychologically devastating than the last. By the time the Mongols reached Eastern Europe, they were employing terror techniques that had been refined through decades of experimentation on populations across Asia. The psychological sophistication of their operations had evolved far beyond anything their enemies could comprehend or counter. The Mongols understood that language itself could be weaponized, and they developed sophisticated techniques for using communication as an instrument of psychological warfare. Their approach to language was not limited to the content of their messages, but extended to the very structure of communication itself, creating new forms of discourse that served to reinforce their psychological dominance. When Mongol envoys arrived at a city to demand surrender, they did not simply present ultimatums. Instead, they engaged in elaborate verbal performances designed to demonstrate the futility of resistance through the very manner of their speech. These envoys were trained in the psychological techniques of their targets, able to speak not just in the local language, but in the specific dialectical forms that carried the most emotional weight for their audiences. To Christian populations, Mongol envoys would speak in the formal Latin of the Church, quoting scripture to argue that resistance to Mongol conquest was resistance to God's will. They would cite biblical passages about the rise and fall of kingdoms, the punishment of the wicked, and the necessity of submitting to higher authority, weaving these references into arguments that presented Mongol conquest as divine judgment. To Islamic populations, the envoys would speak in classical Arabic, quoting the Quran and Hadith to make similar arguments adapted to Islamic theology. They would present themselves as instruments of Allah's wrath, sent to punish the faithful for their deviation from true Islam. They would cite precedents from Islamic history where conquest by foreign powers had served to purify and strengthen the community of believers. But perhaps most unsettling was the way these envoys would incorporate intimate knowledge of local customs and beliefs into their speeches. They would reference specific local legends, name individual community leaders and their families, and demonstrate detailed knowledge of local politics and social structures. This information had been gathered through extensive intelligence networks, but its deployment in surrender demands created the impression that the Mongols possessed supernatural knowledge of their targets. The psychological impact of these performances went far beyond their immediate persuasive effect. Populations that heard Mongol envoys demonstrating such intimate knowledge of their communities often concluded that resistance was impossible because the Mongols seemed to know everything about their potential opponents. The mere demonstration of this knowledge became a form of psychological conquest that preceded physical occupation. The Mongols also developed techniques for corrupting the very language of their victims, introducing new words and concepts that served to normalize Mongol dominance. In conquered territories, they would establish schools where local children were taught to speak about their own culture using Mongol linguistic categories that emphasized its inferiority and primitiveness. These linguistic interventions were not random, but carefully designed to reshape thought patterns themselves. By controlling the vocabulary available for discussing resistance, rebellion, or independence, the Mongols made it increasingly difficult for conquered populations to articulate opposition to their rule. Words that had previously carried positive connotations when applied to resistance against foreign occupation were systematically redefined to carry negative associations. The Mongols introduced new ceremonial languages for conquered populations, requiring that certain topics could only be discussed using specific Mongol-approved terminology. Religious observances had to incorporate Mongol words and phrases. Legal proceedings had to follow Mongol linguistic protocols. Even private family conversations were subject to linguistic regulations that made it dangerous to express certain ideas or emotions. Over time, these linguistic interventions created populations that had lost the ability to articulate alternatives to Mongol rule. Not because they were forbidden from doing so, but because the conceptual vocabulary necessary for such discussions had been systematically removed from their language. The Mongols had discovered that conquering minds was more effective than conquering bodies, and that the most efficient way to conquer minds was to control the very tools of thought itself. Under the later Khans, particularly Menengi and Kublai, Mongol psychological warfare evolved into something that can only be described as a mathematical science. They developed quantitative methods for measuring the effectiveness of different terror techniques, establishing metrics for psychological impact that allowed them to optimize their methods with scientific precision. The Mongols established what they called fear quotients for different populations, numerical ratings based on how much terror was required to achieve complete submission. These calculations took into account cultural factors such as religious beliefs, social structures, economic systems, and historical experiences with warfare. Populations with strong centralized authority structures, they discovered, required different approaches than those with decentralized tribal organizations. Christian populations, with their emphasis on martyrdom and afterlife rewards, required systematic desecration of religious symbols and forced participation in blasphemous acts to break their spiritual resistance. The optimal ratio, according to Mongol calculations, was approximately 1 forced religious violation for every 3 physical tortures. This combination proved most effective at creating the specific type of despair that made Christian populations abandon hope of divine rescue. Islamic populations, with their emphasis on community solidarity and submission to divine will, required different mathematical approaches. The Mongols found that systematic separation of families combined with forced conversions created maximum psychological impact. Their calculations indicated that converting approximately 15% of a population to Christianity while killing 30% and enslaving the remainder created optimal conditions for long-term control. Buddhist populations presented unique challenges that required the development of entirely new mathematical models. The Buddhist emphasis on detachment from material concerns made them relatively resistant to conventional forms of economic coercion. However, the Mongols discovered that systematic destruction of religious texts and forced participation in activities that violated Buddhist dietary restrictions could create psychological breakdown with mathematical predictability. These calculations were not abstract theoretical exercises, but practical tools used in military planning. Mongol commanders would receive detailed mathematical assessments of their targets, including specific recommendations for how many people to kill, how many to enslave, which religious practices to target, and how long to continue psychological pressure before attempting to establish permanent control. The Mongols also developed mathematical models for predicting the spread of terror beyond the immediate target of conquest. They calculated how stories of their atrocities would travel along trade routes, how long it would take for these stories to reach different populations, and how the details would change as they spread. These calculations allowed them to time their campaigns for maximum psychological impact, ensuring that each new conquest would benefit from the terror created by previous operations. Perhaps most disturbing was the Mongol development of what they called generational trauma metrics, mathematical models for predicting how psychological damage would be transmitted from parents to children. They discovered that certain types of trauma, particularly those involving forced participation in atrocities, created lasting psychological damage that would affect not just the immediate victims, but their descendants for multiple generations. These generational calculations influenced Mongol decisions about which members of conquered populations to spare and which to kill. They would deliberately spare individuals who had been subjected to the most psychologically damaging experiences, reasoning that these survivors would pass their trauma to their children, creating populations that would be psychologically predisposed to submission even generations after the original conquest. The mathematical sophistication of these approaches created a form of psychological warfare that was unprecedented in human history. The Mongols had transformed terror from an art into a science, developing quantitative methods for measuring and optimizing human suffering. This scientific approach to cruelty represented a fundamental evolution in human evil, establishing precedents that would echo through the darkest chapters of subsequent history. The collapse of the Mongol Empire in the 14th century did not end the psychological techniques that Genghis Khan and his successors had developed. Instead, these methods were inherited and refined by subsequent civilizations, creating a dark lineage of terror techniques that would shape human conflict for centuries to come. The Ottoman Empire, rising to power in the wake of Mongol decline, adopted and systematized many Mongol psychological warfare techniques. The Ottoman practice of devshirme, the systematic recruitment of Christian children for conversion to Islam and service in the Janissary Corps, was directly modeled on Mongol techniques for breaking family bonds and creating soldiers with no loyalty except to the state. The Ottomans refined the Mongol understanding that children taken from their families at young ages could be transformed into perfect instruments of imperial power. But where the Mongols had used this technique primarily for military purposes, the Ottomans expanded it into a comprehensive system for social control, creating an entire class of administrators and military officers who had been psychologically severed from their birth communities. The Spanish conquistadors in the Americas employed psychological warfare techniques that bore unmistakable similarities to Mongol methods. The systematic destruction of Aztec and Inca religious sites, the forced conversion of indigenous populations, and the use of terror as a tool for preventing resistance, all echoed strategies that the Mongols had pioneered centuries earlier. Hernancourt's use of indigenous allies against their own people replicated the Mongol practice of turning conquered populations into instruments of further conquest. The psychological impact of watching former allies participate in the destruction of their own civilization created the same kind of despair and hopelessness that Mongol commanders had learned to exploit. The Atlantic slave trade incorporated Mongol insights about the psychological benefits of separating families and destroying cultural connections. Slave traders deliberately separated family members, mixed individuals from different tribal groups, and suppressed native languages and religious practices, creating psychological conditions that made resistance more difficult and submission more likely. Even the European witch trials of the early modern period showed evidence of Mongol influence, particularly in their use of forced confessions and the systematic destruction of community bonds through accusations and betrayals. The psychological techniques used to break accused witches and force them to implicate their neighbors bore striking similarities to methods the Mongols had developed for turning community members against each other. The French Revolution's reign of terror employed systematic execution methods and public displays of violence that directly paralleled Mongol practices. The use of the guillotine to create efficient mass executions, the public display of severed heads, and the systematic targeting of entire social classes all reflected an understanding of terror as a tool of social transformation that could be traced back to Mongol innovations. Napoleon's military campaigns incorporated psychological warfare techniques that showed clear Mongol influence. His use of rapid movement to create fear, his systematic destruction of enemy morale through propaganda and demonstration of overwhelming force, and his practice of making examples of resistant populations all echoed strategies that Genghis Khan had pioneered. The American Civil War saw the application of Mongol-inspired psychological warfare techniques on an industrial scale. General Sherman's march to the sea, with its systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure and deliberate targeting of non-combatants to break the will of the Confederate population, employed the same strategic logic that Mongol commanders had used to conquer Asia and Europe. The 20th century witnessed the full flowering of psychological warfare techniques that the Mongols had first developed. The Holocaust incorporated Mongol methods of systematic categorization, efficient mass killing, and psychological torture designed to break the will of victims. The Nazi understanding that destroying hope was more effective than simply destroying lives reflected insights that could be traced directly back to 13th century Mongol innovations. Stalin's purges employed the Mongol technique of turning communities against themselves through forced denunciations and systematic betrayal. The Soviet system of informants and the climate of perpetual fear that characterized Stalin's rule created psychological conditions that the Mongols would have immediately recognized and approved. The Khmer Rouge in Cambodia employed perhaps the most direct application of Mongol psychological warfare techniques in modern history. Their systematic destruction of urban populations, their separation of families, their use of children as instruments of terror against adults, and their targeting of intellectual and cultural elites all reflected a sophisticated understanding of Mongol methods adapted to 20th century conditions. In our contemporary world, The psychological warfare techniques pioneered by Genghis Khan have found new expression in digital forms that would have amazed even the most sophisticated Mongol strategists. The internet and social media have created new possibilities for psychological manipulation that exceed anything the Mongols could have imagined. Yet the fundamental principles remain remarkably consistent. Modern cyber warfare employs the same basic strategy that Mongol psychological warfare perfected: the systematic exploitation of fear, uncertainty, and social division to achieve strategic objectives without the need for direct military confrontation. State and non-state actors use digital platforms to spread carefully crafted narratives designed to demoralize opponents, divide communities, and create climates of fear that make resistance more difficult. The techniques of modern disinformation campaigns bear striking similarities to Mongol methods. Just as the Mongols used carefully selected survivors to spread terror-inducing stories along trade routes, modern psychological warriors use social media influencers and bot networks to spread carefully crafted narratives designed to create fear, confusion, and despair among target populations. The Mongol practice of targeting cultural and religious institutions to break the spirit of conquered populations has found new expression in digital attacks on the information systems that modern societies depend upon. Cyber attacks on hospitals, schools, and religious institutions create the same kind of psychological impact that physical destruction of these facilities achieved in medieval times. The Mongol understanding that dividing communities against themselves was more effective than direct conquest has been refined into sophisticated social media campaigns designed to exploit existing social tensions and create new forms of division. The amplification of racial, religious, and political conflicts through carefully targeted digital messaging creates psychological conditions that make democratic governance more difficult and authoritarian solutions more appealing. Modern terrorist organizations have adopted Mongol techniques for using spectacular violence to create psychological impact, far beyond the immediate physical damage of their attacks. The systematic documentation and distribution of atrocities through digital media serves the same function that Mongol pyramids of skulls served in earlier centuries, creating fear that extends far beyond the immediate victims and influencing the behavior of populations that may never be directly threatened. The global nature of modern communications has created possibilities for psychological warfare that exceed even Mongol achievements in scope and reach. A single digital operation can potentially influence the psychological state of billions of people simultaneously, creating fear, confusion, and despair on a scale that would have impressed even Genghis Khan. But perhaps most disturbing is the way that modern technology has made it possible to target individuals with personalized psychological warfare based on detailed knowledge of their personal characteristics, relationships, and vulnerabilities. The same intelligence-gathering techniques that allowed Mongol envoys to demonstrate intimate knowledge of local communities have been refined into digital surveillance systems that can create psychological profiles of unprecedented detail and accuracy. The result is a world where the psychological warfare techniques that Genghis Khan pioneered have been amplified and refined to a degree that makes his achievements seem almost primitive by comparison. The fundamental insight that fear is more powerful than force, that breaking spirits is more effective than breaking bodies, remains as relevant today as it was 8 centuries ago. But the tools available for implementing this insight have evolved to a degree that would have seemed like magic to even the most sophisticated Mongol strategist. This is perhaps the most chilling aspect of Genghis Khan's legacy. Not that his techniques were uniquely evil for their time, but that they represented the discovery of fundamental principles of psychological manipulation that remain valid regardless of technological advancement. The Khan and his successors had discovered something permanent about human nature, something that could be exploited using stone weapons or digital networks with equal effectiveness. As we move deeper into the 21st century, as artificial intelligence and quantum computing create new possibilities for psychological manipulation that we can barely imagine, the shadow of Genghis Khan grows longer rather than shorter. The techniques he pioneered continue to evolve, but their essential logic remains unchanged. The systematic exploitation of human fear and vulnerability in pursuit of power. The question that haunts our contemporary world is not whether we will see the return of Mongol-style psychological warfare, but whether we are already living through its most sophisticated implementation in human history. The Khan's greatest victory may not have been the conquest of the largest land empire in history, but the establishment of a template for psychological domination that remains as effective today as it was when his armies first thundered across the steppes 8 centuries ago. In this sense, we are all citizens of the eternal Mongol Empire, subject to psychological techniques that can be traced directly back to the innovations of Genghis Khan and his successors. The empire of territory may have crumbled, but the empire of fear that he established continues to expand, finding new expression in each generation of technology and conflict. And in the deepest darkness of human possibility, where the most sophisticated tools of the modern world meet the most ancient insights into human cruelty, the spirit of Genghis Khan rides on, eternal and unstoppable, conquering not just lands and peoples, but the very essence of what it means to be human in a world where such conquests are possible.